The Dowager's Darkest Hour. A Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins when a respected dowager faces her darkest hour, and Miss Marple senses that something is terribly wrong. Before we uncover the truth, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Dowager's Last Tea. Rain had settled over Ashcombe village before dawn, leaving the narrow lanes glistening beneath a pale grey sky. It wasn't a violent storm. Just the sort of quiet rain that seemed determined to linger for the entire day. Beyond the church tower stood Blackthorn House, an old manor with ivy climbing its stone walls and tall windows that reflected nothing but clouds. The house had watched generations come and go. It had welcomed weddings, funerals, and family quarrels with equal silence. This morning, however, even the servants sensed something was wrong. The air inside felt strangely heavy, as though the house itself had been waiting through the night for news no one wished to hear. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, the Dowager of Blackthorn House, had lived there alone for nearly 20 years. At 80 years of age, she remained remarkably alert. Her memory rarely failed her. She noticed every loose thread on a servant's coat, every unpaid bill, every careless word spoken at the dinner table. The villagers respected her. Some admired her. Many feared her. She had little patience for foolishness and even less for dishonesty. Still, there were those who remembered another side of her. A widow who quietly paid school fees for struggling families. A woman who never allowed a child to leave her kitchen hungry. She simply preferred kindness to remain unnoticed. Every morning followed the same routine. At precisely 8:30, the butler carried a silver tray upstairs. Fresh tea. Buttered toast. A boiled egg. One folded newspaper placed neatly beside the teacup. Lady Eleanor disliked surprises, and the household knew better than to disturb the order she had kept for decades. When the tray remained outside her bedroom untouched for nearly half an hour, the housekeeper frowned. Lady Eleanor had never ignored breakfast. Not once. She waited another few minutes before quietly asking the butler whether he had heard the bell. "I haven't," he replied, glancing towards the staircase. "And that's not like her." The two exchanged uneasy looks. Neither wished to disturb the dowager unnecessarily, yet neither could explain the silence. At last, the butler lifted the tray once more and climbed the broad staircase, his footsteps echoing softly through the old hall. He paused outside the bedroom door and knocked twice. "My lady," he called gently. "Your breakfast is getting cold." There was no reply. He waited, then knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. Slowly, he turned the brass handle. To his surprise, the door wasn't locked. The curtains had been drawn back, allowing the dull morning light to spill across the room. Lady Eleanor sat beside the window in her favorite high-backed chair, wrapped in a dark wool shawl despite the season. A book rested open upon her lap. Her reading glasses had slipped slightly down her nose, and one hand remained lightly curled around the armrest as though she had simply drifted into sleep. The breakfast tray trembled in the butler's hands. Something wasn't right. There was no movement. No quiet greeting. Not even the sound of breathing. The tray slipped from his grasp. Porcelain shattered across the polished floor. Tea spread beneath the broken cup like a dark stain while the silver spoon spun once before falling still. The noise brought the housekeeper running upstairs. She stopped in the doorway and needed only a single glance to understand why the butler had turned as pale as the wallpaper behind him. Neither servant spoke. There was nothing to say. The village doctor arrived within the hour. His examination was brief, yet his expression changed almost immediately. He removed his spectacles, looked once more at Lady Eleanor, and quietly closed the notebook he always carried. "I'm afraid this wasn't a peaceful passing," he said. "Someone has taken great care to make it appear that way." Word travelled through Ashcombe faster than the rainwater running along the gutters. By midday, every cottage seemed to have its own version of the story. Some claimed the Dowager had finally succumbed to old age. Others insisted they had heard raised voices at Blackthorn House the previous evening. One woman whispered that Lady Eleanor had recently altered her will. Another claimed she'd discovered something so damaging that it threatened the reputation of one of the oldest families in the county. As usual, every rumor grew larger with each telling. Miss Marple listened quietly while pouring herself a cup of tea in her modest sitting room. She never interrupted gossip. People revealed far more when they believed no one was paying close attention. As neighbor after neighbor offered another theory, she simply nodded, thanked them for calling, and watched the rain beyond her window. None of the stories convinced her. They were all too eager. Too neat. Real trouble, she'd learned long ago, rarely announced itself so plainly. She set her teacup upon its saucer and glanced towards Blackthorn House in the distance. An old woman had died inside a locked room. A careful routine had been broken without explanation. Somewhere, hidden beneath polite smiles and respectable manners, someone believed they had committed the perfect crime. Miss Marple wasn't nearly so certain. Chapter 2: Shadows Inside Blackthorn House. By the following morning, Blackthorn House no longer resembled the orderly country manor that Lady Eleanor had ruled with quiet authority for decades. The atmosphere had changed completely. The great entrance hall, usually alive with the sounds of servants beginning another day's work, felt strangely hollow. Conversation stopped the instant someone entered the room. Doors closed more softly than usual. Even the ancient grandfather clock seemed louder, its steady ticking carrying through the silent corridors like a reminder that time had not paused simply because tragedy had arrived. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist that drifted lazily across the gardens, while inside the house every face carried the same uneasy question. If Lady Eleanor had been murdered, then the killer had walked those very halls only hours before. Inspector Bell arrived shortly after breakfast, bringing with him 2 constables and a leather notebook already filled with observations. He greeted the household politely enough, though there was confidence in his manner that suggested he believed the mystery would soon be solved. Miss Marple watched him from the drawing-room window as he crossed the gravel drive. She had met inspectors like him before. Honest men. Hard-working men. Men who trusted evidence, but sometimes overlooked the ordinary little details that rarely seemed important until it was too late. Murder, she had learned long ago, often hid behind the smallest habits. A forgotten glance. A misplaced object. A sentence spoken too quickly. The inspector began his investigation upstairs in Lady Eleanor's bedroom. The room had been left almost exactly as it had been discovered. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting pale reflections across polished furniture that had belonged to generations of the Ashcombe family. Lady Eleanor still sat peacefully in her favourite chair beside the window, looking more like a woman resting after a long afternoon than someone whose life had ended so suddenly. The breakfast tray had been carefully rearranged after the shattered china had been cleared away. The teacup remained almost completely full. The butter on the toast had begun to harden. The newspaper lay neatly folded, untouched from the moment it had been delivered. Inspector Bell stood quietly beside the tray for several moments before making another note. "It seems obvious enough," he finally said. "If poison was used, it was almost certainly placed in the tea." Miss Marple said nothing. She simply allowed her eyes to rest on the untouched cup. There was something about the scene that resisted such an easy answer. The inspector had already reached a conclusion before asking whether the conclusion itself made sense. She had seen that mistake many times before. People often searched for complicated explanations while ignoring the plain facts sitting directly in front of them. The morning passed with interviews. One after another, every servant was asked to recount the previous evening in careful detail. Mrs. Wilcox, the faithful housekeeper, explained that Lady Eleanor had spent much of supper reading the same letter several times before folding it away inside her pocket. According to her, the Dowager had appeared thoughtful rather than frightened. She had eaten well, thanked the cook as she always did, and retired to the library for coffee with her nephew before going upstairs. Nothing in her behavior suggested she expected danger. The cook confirmed much the same account. Lady Eleanor had enjoyed her meal and had even complimented the apple pudding, something she did only when it was particularly good. The gardener insisted he had locked the rear gate shortly after sunset and had seen no visitors entering the grounds. The butler repeated his familiar routine almost word for word. Coffee had been served in the library at 9 o'clock. Lady Eleanor had wished everyone good night shortly afterwards. At 8:30 the following morning he had carried breakfast upstairs exactly as he had every day for the past 15 years. Nothing had been different until the silence behind the bedroom door. Richard Ashcombe entered the drawing-room last. Lady Eleanor's nephew carried himself with remarkable composure considering the circumstances. His dark tweed coat was immaculate, his shoes freshly polished, and his voice remained calm throughout every question. He spoke warmly of his aunt, describing her as firm but fair, a woman who expected honesty from others because she demanded it from herself. He admitted they occasionally disagreed about family matters, though he insisted such disagreements had never become serious. "We argued from time to time," Richard said with a tired smile. "Families always do. But I'd never wish her harm. She was the last close relation I had." The inspector nodded thoughtfully. "You were with her in the library last night." "For about half an hour. We shared coffee and discussed the estate. She seemed perfectly healthy when I left. And after that, I went straight to bed." His answers came smoothly, almost too smoothly. Miss Marple noticed that while Richard's words never faltered, one small habit continued throughout the conversation. Every few moments, almost without realizing it, he rubbed his thumb across the sleeve of his coat near the cuff. It was the movement of someone expecting to find something beneath his fingers. Something that was no longer there. The gesture lasted barely a second each time, yet it repeated itself often enough to catch her attention. Small habits rarely appeared by accident. Once the questioning ended, the inspector remained occupied with his notes while Miss Marple quietly excused herself and wandered through the manor. No one stopped her. Elderly ladies with knitting bags were seldom considered dangerous investigators. She moved slowly into the library where Lady Eleanor had spent her final evening. The room smelled faintly of old leather bindings, polished oak, and the ashes of last night's dying fire. Shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, holding hundreds of books collected across generations. Most appeared untouched for years beneath a delicate layer of dust. As she examined the shelves, something interrupted the otherwise perfect order. Between two large history volumes sat a narrow empty space where a smaller book had recently been removed. The surrounding shelves carried a thin coating of dust, but the empty space remained perfectly clean. Someone had taken that particular book only recently. There were no signs of anyone searching through the shelves at random. Whoever removed it had known exactly where to find it. Miss Marple stood quietly for several moments, studying the gap before closing the cabinet doors. A missing book by itself meant very little. People borrowed books every day. Yet timing mattered. Lady Eleanor was dead. The library had been one of the last rooms she visited. Now a single volume had vanished without anyone mentioning it. That, Miss Marple felt, deserved rather more attention than anyone else seemed willing to give it. She stepped outside through the library's glass doors into the rear gardens. The rain had almost stopped, leaving tiny drops of water clinging to every rose and hedge. The gravel paths curved neatly around flower beds that Lady Eleanor had insisted remain immaculate throughout every season. Miss Marple wandered without haste, occasionally pausing to admire a rose bush or straighten a bent branch. To anyone watching from the house, she appeared to be nothing more than an elderly woman enjoying the fresh air. Near an old stone bench beneath a spreading oak tree, something caught the light. It was small enough to escape notice unless someone happened to be looking at exactly the right moment. She bent carefully and picked it up. Resting in her hand was a silver coat button engraved with the Ashcombe family crest. A short length of dark thread still clung to the back, suggesting it had only recently been torn free. The rain had washed the surrounding stones clean, yet the button had become trapped between two pieces of gravel where the water could not carry it away. She slipped the button into her handbag without drawing attention to it and slowly returned towards the house. The inspector was already waiting in the drawing room, looking considerably more satisfied than he had earlier that morning. He gathered everyone together before speaking. "I believe we've established what happened," he announced confidently. "The killer poisoned Lady Eleanor's morning tea, expecting her to drink it as she always did. The difficulty now is discovering who had the opportunity." Several members of the household exchanged anxious glances. Richard folded his arms and gave a slow nod, apparently relieved that the investigation seemed to be moving in a clear direction. Miss Marple remained seated quietly beside the fireplace, her knitting resting forgotten upon her lap. She allowed a brief silence to settle over the room before speaking. "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "may I ask you one small question?" "Of course." "If the tea was poisoned, how did Lady Eleanor die from it?" The inspector looked puzzled. "She drank it." Miss Marple shook her head almost imperceptibly before turning towards the breakfast tray. "The cup is still full. The toast hasn't been touched. Even the egg remains unopened. Lady Eleanor never ate her breakfast." The room fell silent as every eye turned towards the tray. Inspector Bell stared at it for several long moments. His confidence faded as quickly as it had appeared. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly and looked around the room. "Whoever planned this murder expected us to focus on breakfast," she said quietly. "But Lady Eleanor's last meal wasn't breakfast at all. The answer lies somewhere earlier, somewhere inside this house, and someone here already knows exactly where to find it." Chapter 3: The Dowager's Darkest Hour. A restless silence settled over Blackthorn House after Miss Marple pointed out the untouched breakfast. The inspector abandoned his theory at once, though he seemed reluctant to admit it aloud. Instead, he ordered the household to remain on the estate while every room was searched again from top to bottom. Cupboards were opened. Desks were emptied. Bedrooms were examined one after another. Yet with every passing hour, the mystery only seemed to grow deeper. Nothing connected the scattered pieces. There was no murder weapon. No obvious poison. No broken lock. Whoever had planned Lady Eleanor's death had done so with remarkable patience, leaving behind almost nothing except questions. Miss Marple, however, had stopped thinking about the bedroom entirely. Her thoughts kept returning to the library. More specifically, to the missing book. She couldn't explain why it troubled her so much, only that it felt less like a forgotten volume and more like something removed in haste. Books rarely disappeared from carefully ordered libraries without leaving a reason behind. Lady Eleanor had valued order almost as highly as honesty. If one book had vanished overnight, then someone had believed it contained something worth hiding. Before sunrise the next morning, the mystery took an unexpected turn. The butler discovered a worn leather diary lying neatly outside the library door. It had not been there when the house was locked the previous evening. Someone had returned under cover of darkness and quietly placed it where it could hardly be missed. The inspector immediately suspected a guilty conscience. Miss Marple thought otherwise. A truly guilty person rarely surrendered evidence without expecting something in return. Whoever had returned the diary believed they had removed the danger already. They wanted the book found because they thought it no longer mattered. Inside the diary, Lady Eleanor had written faithfully for years. Most entries described ordinary village affairs, family dinners, repairs to the estate, and observations about neighbors who amused or disappointed her. Then, several weeks before her death, the tone changed. She wrote of missing estate funds that no accountant could explain. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. Payments hidden behind respectable paperwork. Lady Eleanor had quietly begun checking every account herself, trusting no one else. Her final entries were written in a noticeably firmer hand. I know who has been taking the money. Tomorrow I shall tell everyone. There will be no more lies. There was no entry after that. Inspector Bell immediately gathered the household in the drawing room. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows once again, as though the weather itself refused to leave until the truth had been spoken. Every member of the household stood waiting. The servants looked frightened. Richard Ashcombe remained calm, though far less comfortably than before. He kept his hands folded behind his back, avoiding Miss Marple's eyes whenever she glanced in his direction. The inspector cleared his throat. The diary tells us Lady Eleanor had uncovered financial theft from the estate. That gives us motive, but not proof. We still need evidence linking someone directly to her death. Miss Marple remained seated quietly beside the fireplace. Her knitting rested untouched across her lap. After a moment, she reached into her handbag and placed the small silver button upon the table. It rolled only a few inches before coming to rest. "I believe," she said softly, "this belongs to you, Mr. Ashcombe." Richard looked at the button. For the briefest instant, the color left his face. "I've no idea where you found that." "In the rose garden," Miss Marple replied. "Near the library doors. Exactly where someone would have walked after leaving the house late at night." Richard forced a smile. "Buttons fall off coats all the time." "They do," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "What they don't usually do is disappear from a coat that now has one missing." Every eye turned towards Richard's sleeve. One button was gone. The room became very still. Miss Marple continued in the same calm voice. "Lady Eleanor wasn't poisoned at breakfast because she never touched her breakfast. She died long before that tray reached her room. The coffee served in the library the previous evening was the last thing she drank. You prepared it yourself after sending the butler to fetch more coal for the fire. It would have taken only a few seconds to replace her usual heart medicine with another bottle. She trusted the medicine because she'd taken it every evening for years. She never suspected the bottle had been changed." Richard stared at the floor. His shoulders slowly sank as though a weight he had carried for months had finally become too heavy to bear. "I didn't mean," he began quietly before stopping altogether. "No. That's not true. I knew exactly what I was doing." No one interrupted him. "I'd been taking money from the estate for years. Small amounts at first. I always believed I'd replace it before anyone noticed. Then the debts grew larger. My aunt discovered everything. She told me she'd reveal it the next morning. Once she made up her mind. He gave a bitter laugh. There was no changing it. So you decided to silence her instead, said the inspector. Richard closed his eyes. Yes. The confession settled over the room like a heavy curtain. Mrs. Wilcox quietly wiped tears from her face. The old butler lowered his head. No one seemed angry. Only disappointed. The tragedy was not simply that Lady Eleanor had died. It was that the person she had trusted most had betrayed her. Inspector Bell stepped forward with the constables and placed Richard under arrest. This time there was no argument. Richard surrendered without resistance, pausing only once to glance towards the empty chair where his aunt had so often spent her evenings reading. Then he walked silently from the room, and the front door closed behind him. For several moments, nobody spoke. The house seemed strangely lighter, as though it had finally released a breath it had been holding since the Dowager's death. Outside, the clouds began to break apart, allowing pale afternoon sunlight to spill across the gardens. The roses, still covered in raindrops, shimmered quietly in the fresh light. Inspector Bell turned towards Miss Marple with an embarrassed smile. "I was looking at the breakfast," he admitted. "You were looking at the person who wanted us to keep looking there." Miss Marple smiled gently as she gathered her knitting. Murderers often work very hard to direct our attention elsewhere. The trick is to notice what they don't expect anyone to notice. She paused at the doorway and looked back towards the silent drawing room one last time. If you enjoyed solving this mystery alongside Miss Marple, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Haunting Vales, and share your own thoughts in the comments. Every quiet village keeps its secrets for only so long. Before long, another knock will come at Miss Marple's door, and another mystery will be waiting on the other side.